But in going to work each day, it's about, how do I be a Christian in what I'm doing? How do I represent Jesus? I'm an ambassador. And being an ambassador, quite often you're called to do fairly menial type things, but be known. Firstly, you've got to be known as the ambassador. Can't do your job as an ambassador if you're not known as the ambassador. So you've got to be known as that. The key for me is being able to tell story. And so, and part of being able to tell story is you've got to be living a life that actually generates those stories for you.
Yep.
So you've got to be involved in ministry. You've got to be participating in the call to mission by God.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Monday Movement podcast, where we have deep conversations with Christians who are called to the marketplace. We had a conversation with Peter Jones on the Lead Well, Live Well podcast, which we enjoyed very much. And he mentioned that he was a pastor in an Anglican church, so obviously has a faith journey. So we thought we'd invite him back and talk through some of that. Peter, lovely to have you back.
Mark, it's good to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
You're the founder and managing director of Prological, and you do supply chain consulting. But you used to be a pastor in the Anglican church.
That's correct.
Now, I'm sure as you moved from faith-based work into the secular environment, some people would have thought you've gone apostate. How did you navigate that? And is God really interested in your work?
Look, the funny story is, I say to people, my mum lost a bet with God. And that's what caused the transformation, and I've been paying the collateral outcome of that little wager ever since.
Yep.
But in reality, life hasn't really changed that much because I'm still in full-time ministry.
I love that.
It's just how I get paid has changed,
Yeah.
and the activity that I do each day changed a bit, but not totally.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's the same, I often coin the phrase that ever since God gave the promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as many as the stars of the sky, effectively God's setting up his commission for the nation of Israel to be a light to the nations, which then is throughout the whole of the Old Testament. So God has been on mission forever.
Yeah.
And as a follower of Jesus, he calls us to be on mission with him.
Yes.
So whether I'm working vocationally within a church or vocationally in a secular environment, God's still on mission, and he still calls me to be on mission with him.
Yeah.
And so at that level, not much has changed.
It's a great perspective. We are all in full-time ministry. Some of us might be working in a church, but others are called to different parts of the marketplace. Can you tell us a little bit about your faith journey? Were you raised in a Christian home?
I was raised in a Christianised home. So both my parents went to church basically until they got married. And both were quite involved at different stages during their teenage years and had been to Sunday school and all of those sorts of things. I remember being taken to Sunday school as a small child, and that continued through to the end of primary school. And then, don't really understand how or why it happened, but then I didn't follow through continuing on at church into high school. And then for year 11, I changed high schools and went from a very big high school and a big cohort at a school in Wollongong, and we moved up to Moss Vale to quite a small school where the whole school was smaller than just my year cohort at my previous one. So into year 11, we just had 39 students at the start of the year.
Right.
On my very first day there, we walked into a science lab where we were to select the subjects which we were going to do for the year. So we selected our subjects on the first day of the year.
Right.
And there were two clusters in the classroom, one around the science island as soon as you walk in the door of the lab, and the other cluster was around the diagonal rear island at the back of the room.
Okay.
So I went to the island at the back of the room.
Yep.
Met a fella named David Wood, who became a Christian subsequent to our year 11 journey together as well. And just said to David, "G'day, I'm David, I'm Peter, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "See those people all over there? They're all of the Christians." and it blew me away. I'm just thinking, what a weird thing to say to someone you've just met.
Yep.
Anyway, we did what we had to do, got told to go down to the hall, and Mr. Mackenzie, the principal, addressed us as moving into the senior school. While we were waiting for Mr. Mackenzie, the Christians were in one row of seats together, and those that didn't identify with that group so closely were in the row behind them, sat next to David because he was my new best friend at school. Yeah. And on the other side was a guy called Charlie Armstrong. Charlie introduced himself. G'day, my name's Charlie, blah, 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 for 2 minutes. See this row in front of us? They're all of the Christians. And now I'm thinking this is really weird because two people have thrown this strange comment to me in quick succession. Anyway, throughout the year, that cohort of Christians pursued me along with others, found out that I like cycling, talked me into going on a Scripture Union bike camp in the August school holidays of that year. Yeah. We studied the book of Romans. At the end of the week, someone said, would you like to become a Christian? I said, no, I can't do that. Wouldn't be enough to turn over a new leaf. I'd have to turn over a whole forest, and I'm not quite up to that task. Yep. So moved on. They invited me to the school fellowship group at lunchtime, went and told them what happened at the camp. They continued to pursue me. And early December that year, 1979, Keith Green was coming to Australia and did a number of concerts. Yeah. They tried to talk me into coming to the Keith Green concert with them. I declined, had an end-of-year party on about the Wednesday or Thursday before the weekend. The party got cancelled by the parents of the person who was hosting. Mm-hmm. The Christians found out it had been cancelled, so it was straight on to me. Yeah. Oh, Peter, your party's been cancelled. You're coming to Keith Green with us. So I went. Yeah. And on that night, Keith Green was talking about living a life of integrity, and he positioned that in consistent with what your heart knows is true. Mm-hmm. And he was walking backwards and forwards across the platform during one particular part of the night, and he said, look, if you believe in certain sorts of things, and he pointed to the direction that would mean your life would head, but you're actually walking in a direction that's opposite to that or counter to that, walking in the opposite direction to the one he'd previously pointed out, then you're probably going to struggle for a lot of life because you're actually not living a life of integrity. And he used the word hypocrisy in terms of those base foundations of your life, in believing one set of things to be true but living a different way. And then he talked about, how to get this alignment to happen, which was sort of reinforcing stuff we'd done at the Scripture Union camp. And, and the Christians at school walking past the corridor saying, Jones, God's after you. So all of this sort of stuff came to a moment on that night. And so on that night, Keith Green said, those that would like to accept Jesus as their Lord and Saviour, sort of stand up now. So across the Hordern Pavilion in Sydney, a number of us, stood up, I don't know how, hundreds maybe. And Keith Green prayed for us as we made that decision on that night. The next morning at about 8 o'clock, a guy called Brian Barham was knocking on my door, Bible in hand. He'd been with us the night before, and we did our first little Bible study the very next morning. So that was the transition.
That's wonderful. Like, we've known each other for quite some time. I've never heard the story. That's just so good. That's so good. I avoid Keith Green whenever possible because his songs are way too convicting.
That's right. That's
good. Right. But what a wonderful example of the faithfulness of Christians reaching out to you, and just I have a similar testimony with the Hound of Heaven, where people were just everywhere trying to introduce me to Jesus, and I just didn't want to know about it at the time. Probably a slightly more aggressive response than you had, but the faithfulness of people reaching out, wanting to connect, recognizing the need and sharing the gospel. Fabulous. Keith Green he's up there, isn't he? Like it's just quite an amazing story in his own right.
And that year 11 cohort, they knew a God that was on mission, and they were on mission with him as well at that time.
Faithful. So you took that into the church. I mean, you ended up, as you said, into the church, and then transitioned out into business, and see that as a equally sacred calling. How do you work that out as far as walking every day with the Lord, but in a secular environment doing seemingly secular things?
So my whole world is firstly not just around my secular vocation and Prological, which I own and lead. So I'm still very involved in our church. So straight away that creates so that engagement gives me story, which allows me to share. So, I will quite often lead into a conversation with someone that I haven't met before and say, what keeps you off the streets between Monday and Friday? And so that introduction then usually elicits a story about the other things that they're involved in life. So they'll regularly go to work first, but I'll expand that out into other things. But then usually reciprocates with the question from them to me, and so at that level straight away can go to the stories about the other things that I'm involved in.
Yeah,
and sometimes that goes to a why question as well. And so I enjoy going into that sort of space. So that's one element. A more overt element is, I guess, having been a pastor in a church for more than a decade, was wired my brain up to respond to people in certain ways.
Yeah.
In business, people generally understand fairly quickly that I'm at least as interested in them as I am in whatever opportunity they may be able to afford my business.
Yep.
And more often than not, probably more interested in them than I am in my business. The interesting thing around that is that approach probably helps the business as well. So people then warm to that, and they know that I have their interest at the fore. When professional relationships then develop over months and some years and quite a few decades now, you actually get to know people at a level beyond what might happen in a formal professional environment. And so we find out about people that are having trouble having kids and the journey that they might be on with their spouse to address that, or marriage that's not going really well, or sickness that has befallen them or someone close to them or a child that's come out of left field. And so, 25 years in a professional environment, those sorts of things happen fairly frequently now. You hear those stories from people that I have a level of interpersonal relationship beyond what would happen just within the boardroom. So those opportunities 100% of the time provide me with the opportunity to say, I have a bit of a relationship with the big man upstairs.
Yeah.
I'm going to take this to him as well.
Love that.
I have never, ever had a negative response to that. Never had a negative response.
Yeah.
And most of the time, I get a really engaging, positive response. Sometimes it's just thanks a lot, politely and friendly and with a warmth, but not enthusiastic. Sure. That happens occasionally, and that's as worst it gets.
Yeah.
Most of the time, in those scenarios, it's really, really welcomed. And then often, depending on the physical environment that we're in and the nature of the relationship, I'll say, can I pray for you now? I've got one friend, he and his wife have twins, and he attributes me as being responsible for the twins because they'd tried to have babies for years. Nothing was working. They were on the last roll of the dice with IVF. And so, I remember praying for him he was a state manager of a transport company in Victoria at the time, showing me around their new shed. And we were just chatting as we were going around. I'd already worked with him for better than a decade across a couple of companies. Yeah. And so we just stopped and I prayed with him in that moment. It was a couple of weeks later that they got the news that they were actually, they'd had success in terms of a pregnancy that it was had started, and that ended up in the birth of their twins about 8 months later.
So good.
Yeah. And I've got another good friend who I've worked with now, who's one of the first transport company owners that I met back in 1996 when I very first started in the industry. So we were both young guys back then.
Yep.
And he had a fairly significant brain issue occur. We were in a meeting where his company, with my client, and his company wasn't doing a great job at that time. There were all sorts of reasons, not necessarily his fault, but it wasn't going well. Quite a stressful meeting. And in the middle of the meeting, he got up and went out, quite emotionally moved, but not angry. It was a different sort of emotion. So because I'd known him for better than 20 years at this stage, I just said to my client and some other people, I'm just going to go see how he is. So I went out and found him down in the kitchen, and he was in tears. And then he told me what was going on for him personally in that moment. And in that moment we prayed. And then since then, those ailments have gone. And so,
God's good.
I'm not one to get over enthusiastic about saying this prayer equaled this miraculous outcome. But from that person's perspective, that moment of our long professional relationship a moment of tension where he was feeling under some pressure, and I was party to creating that because I'm there representing my client despite the professional friendship I have with the service provider.
Sure.
And then for that to then, in that other environment, that person knew what my real priority was and what really made me tick.
Yeah.
And that was my concern for him as an individual, far more important than any of the other stuff that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And to, in that moment, we did have a physical embrace, and to be able to pray for him in that moment was quite a moving time for both of us, and a memorable time for both of us as well.
Yeah.
It's become part of that experience is part of my story.
And God places us in these scenarios, doesn't He? Like He's never surprised. And I think if we're willing and available and seeking to serve Him, those opportunities will be there. We just need to be mindful of the opportunities as they come up. It's a great perspective I think you've got there, where you've taken it's a very people-orientated, pastoral mindset and way of operating from the church into the business environment. Can I ask you a little bit more about a lot of things that you've done have been incredibly innovative and creative. You've disrupted various different ways of doing things around supply chain and come up with some amazing changes in the way that people do things. Do you attribute some of that to just the way that you're wired and innovation and thinking, or is that an inspiration thing? Like what is that for you?
I haven't really thought too much about where the origins of that lies within me, but I've never been a rule follower, and I learnt early on that served me well.
Yeah.
If I followed the other two rules of not breaking, there are two rules that are absolutely ironclad if you want to break the rules. So that's an irony, isn't it? If you want to break the rules, there's two rules.
Enlighten me.
Yeah. The first rule is nothing can go wrong.
Yeah.
And the second rule is no one can find out.
Right.
So
hide it whenever possible.
Yeah, you follow those two rules in breaking rules, and it'll serve you very, very well.
Yeah.
So that's one element. The other thing that I often reflect on is the light bulb was not invented by designing a better candle. And so to have a better tomorrow actually does require a different way of thinking about things. So I will often start with the proposition that if there is a problem here, I'm unlikely to solve it with the things that are on the table that are attempting to solve it now, because if they were going to solve it, it would have been solved, and it hasn't.
Yeah.
So my mind immediately goes to, here are all of the things that I'm wasting my time looking at, because they're all of the normal things that everybody's always been doing.
Yep.
And none of that is delivering the outcomes that we're looking for. So that then drives me outside of whatever is known and attempting to work in the unknown. So by maybe in my mind going to that place, I actually start in the unknown rather than try and work from the known in a progressive or logical manner. So by starting there, and I guess practicing that for a while, I've been able to create something in the darkness of the unknown.
Yeah, I like that. Because God, He's the ultimate creator, and we're plugged into Him. So I think He's sounds an odd thing to say, an underrated source of creative
inspiration. Absolutely.
And He's wired us, and we're made in His image. And I think there's something inherently good and satisfying to Him to see us operate creatively. And I think as Christians, there's arguably a Christian advantage because we're plugged into the Creator. We hold things lightly on the earth. We know we're stewards. We maybe take a longer term thinking, maybe more, if we're operating correctly, I think we're probably more secure in trusting Him. So we're willing to try things and maybe have a different sort of risk profile. So there is, I think, ways of operating as a Christian in the workplace that gives us a Christian advantage. You've covered this a little bit, but I just wouldn't mind just digging a little bit deeper. A lot of people struggle with how do they share Jesus in the workplace, and there's a lot of wisdom required these days, particularly in an environment where they may not be working for themselves; they're working in a more corporate environment. If you don't want to spend all your time in front of HR or get cancelled, and I think there's a fear of Christians to talk about things. And then there's the dichotomy between how much of it is, working with excellence and integrity and demonstrating transformed life and letting people ask the question, and how much of it is sort of front foot, looking for the opportunity to share the gospel more specifically. How do you wrestle with all that? Because you have a lot of people working for you. That the vast majority are not Christians. Same with your clients, like mine. So how do you wrestle with that?
I guess I don't wake up each day with the prayer of, Lord Jesus, guide me to someone I can share the gospel with today. Yep. So I don't start there on that perspective. That part of my life gets great opportunity within my Christian ministry endeavours, where that is front and centre in what we're trying to achieve. But in going to work each day, it's about, how do I be a Christian in what I'm doing? How do I represent Jesus? I'm an ambassador. And being an ambassador, quite often you're called to do fairly menial type things, but be known. Firstly, you've got to be known as the ambassador. You can't do your job as an ambassador if you're not known as the ambassador. So you've got to be known as that. The key for me is being able to tell story. And so, and part of being able to tell story is you've got to be living a life that actually generates those stories for you. Yep. So you've got to be involved in ministry. You've got to be participating in the call to mission by God. You've got to have a living, breathing faith of your own. Absolutely. You've got to be interacting with Christian community and receiving the blessing of that to the level that you actually understand what you have. Because by understanding the blessing that we have within Christian community, when that's working well, that in a lot of instances provides a story that other people are looking for. The great irony of our world at the moment is mental health is off the charts. Yeah. Most families are wrestling with how to raise my children. We've got government engaging in control and legislation around areas of life that they've never got involved in before. There's, helicopter parenting has taken on levels beyond what we could have ever envisaged before. And within all of that, there is stress and worry and concern, which of itself then amplifies the already present objective issues. Yeah. And Jesus offers answers to a lot of these challenges. Yeah. If only just to be in a community where you can talk about these things with other people and get a perspective that actually is helpful. Yeah. So those are the things that I can take into the workplace, which then allow me to engage with people that I've got to know reasonably well. So firstly, most people know I'm an ambassador for Jesus fairly early on in our relationship because they just ask me, what do you do during the week? Their reciprocal answer to, what keeps you off the streets during the week. So very early on, they'll know that I'm involved in a large church. I will try and sneak in there as much as possible, that we're a very community-minded church, community-facing. We're a church that has as a core value that we want to be adding value to our community. And if we don't have a value proposition, then, of course, why would you engage? So we're trying to add value to people's lives. So they get that story fairly early, and already they're thinking, this is not a view of a Christian that the Sydney Morning Herald might portray. And that's generally well received. Then beyond that, it's about building the relationship and taking those opportunities to share my experiences when I'm asked the question, or to offer that pastoral element of, that story about, I know the big man upstairs, I talk to him a fair bit. Do you mind if I chat to him about this situation in your life? And then even progress further when appropriate and transition that into prayer. There's been a few times in my career where I've encouraged people to get along to a church and even made connection for them, and that's been successful a couple of times. But that's the rare occasion. Yeah. Not sure my job is to walk in the boardroom and my objective is for all of those people to become Christians. But most people don't become Christians in one event. My own story, started with my parents' spasmodic engagement with the church that led to me going to Sunday school. That built some sort of value foundation of belief in my life. Christians in year 11 harassing me through to a Keith Green concert. So it's a couple of decade journey even for myself.
Steps on the journey.
Yes.
I think that's a very healthy way to look at it. I think if we're fully engaged in what we do in a business environment, fully invested, and then the evangelism piece is we're not hiding that we're Christians. We're overt, but we're not pushing a barrow. So it becomes a natural part of our expression. We recognize the opportunities.
And the relationships that we have. It becomes normalises our relationships as well. And so,
and you talked about being very connected to a local community. I'm glad you said that, because I think a lot of people in the marketplace movement, if you like, have got disillusioned with church. They've kind of separated themselves. And I mean, the Bible's very clear. We're not to give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing. We need to be connected to a local community. We need to. That's part of the deal. Churches sometimes find it difficult to, particularly church leaders, to understand, particularly business people or career professionals or people who see, a big expression of their faith outside of the church environment, may not have enough time to serve, etc. What would you say to people who are struggling with being understood in a church environment and sort of a bit reluctant to engage?
You've taken your lamp and put it under the bushel. We do need. I feel like I've got to be quite intentional to take the gifts and the skills that I have to get them mobilised within the church. They're not overtly welcomed by everybody.
Because business thinking can sometimes be a bit of an anathema to
yeah, and even to use that language for some people is really, really off-putting.
For sure.
Yeah, church is not a business. You can't approach this like a business. And absolutely, I agree with that. Church is first and foremost the bride of Christ, and it's a community of believers, and the intention is to find a place for the expression of gifts, for the building up of the saints, to prepare people for a life which leads to a surety in eternity. So that's the purpose of the church.
Yeah.
As against business, the objective is generally far more objective and far easier to identify.
Yeah.
And so in that level, there's a great difference. But I go back to the Apostle Paul, and you look at his first, second, and third missionary journeys and the places that he went. And within those, he talks about the places he has ambition for, some he didn't get to. All of the places that he went were the commercial, cultural and educational capitals of the world at that time. He did not go to the small villages where there were suffering people that needed to hear the gospel, places where it would have been good to go and plant churches, and maybe to a large extent easier because they were smaller, less influential, less controversial environments to go into. But he was phenomenally strategic in the places that he went, in understanding the mission that he was on. And, and in hindsight, we look back and the Apostle Paul went and put the foundations in place that then allowed the first post-apostle apostle generation, the laity, to then grow the church, which then by the 3rd century was the prevailing culture across all of Europe, and had outlasted and then overridden the strong Roman culture that had dominated it. And with that, it was because of the Christian values and things like the value of people and
Jesus' approach to
hospitals
women
and
was a massive part.
Absolutely, very, very radical. And
Yeah.
haven't we got that wrong? There's a whole story there. Yeah, Christendom's done itself a great injustice there in not understanding the radicalness of both Jesus' approach to women and the Apostle Paul's approach to women, and totally misrepresented in secular world as to how radical they were in their day. But coming back to this, Paul was unbelievably strategic in the way he went about things, and I'm not sure that Christian leaders running churches and larger portfolios have a good handle on how to develop strategy and stay focused on the things that are required in order to execute that strategy, understanding that in doing that, the foundations they build for lots of other things to then grow. And so I look back on the Apostle Paul as a great strategic thinker, very deliberate and very selective in what he did do, which also meant he said no to other things And in Christendom, we find it difficult to say no to a good thing.
We do.
You put a malnutritioned mother with a dying baby in her hands on a screen within a church, and people will very quickly gravitate towards that. We talk about developing gospel material to train Christian leaders in other parts of the world and try and raise money for that. Very, very difficult. And I don't want to walk away from, and we're very involved ourselves in a lot of helps ministries around the world and how important they are to mobilise the resources that we can generate in our culture. But I also know what is in God's economy required, and that is for people to be trained, to be able to train others in the gospel so that the baton that is passed to one generation can be passed on to another generation more profoundly. So that's strategic thinking, whereas I can have the emotional response to, we very quickly get engaged in all sorts of helps ministry, and that helps for a moment. But it's a bit like when Mary and Martha were in the room, and one of them was off doing the housework and the other one was sitting at Jesus' feet being taught. And Jesus spoke there about, who was making the wiser strategic decision. And one was coming to understand Christ and what his mission was and preparing her to be better understanding of what was going on, knowing that she was going to be passing that on to other generations. And so we take that story from that perspective in that moment. One was doing what had to be done, the housework, but the other, intentionally or unintentionally, though, was actually taking the wiser, more strategic view of things. So I don't think either of them understood what was going on in that moment. But if we take that principle and apply it, and it can help us work out what we need to say no to, as the Apostle Paul said no to many things, and what we say yes to. And he understood where his big strategic markers were, and he went for those and he got those in place. And the legacy that got left because of that very strategic approach he took to his mission was so well executed.
Very clear, very, very clear priorities.
Yeah.
So, talking about Mary and Martha, we get very, very busy doing church or doing things in business, and yet this opportunity to have Christ center and foremost in our thinking. What sort of personal disciplines do you have to ensure that your walk with him is healthy, that, on a Wednesday afternoon in a tough board meeting, or you got a client that's, you're wrestling with the client for some particular reason, or need some breakthrough. What personal disciplines do you have in your life in order to be able to keep him front and center?
Look, you've pushed one of my buttons here. I guess my life has been a reasonably undisciplined life relative to, what other people might look at as good practice. And I'm aware of the gaps that have occurred in my life as a result of a discipline that is a self-discipline that's at a lower level than what I understand to be optimal. Over the decades, though, in wrestling with that, I've become more comfortable with it because that's not a position that ends in isolation. So the lack of discipline, so get up each morning, read my scriptures, do my journaling, etc. I, at one level, envy people that can do that. But because I'm not doing that, but I am busy doing lots of other things, I've sat more comfortably with the expression of my faith and the way in which it works out. So most days I will engage with the scriptures at some level. There'd hardly be a day go by nowadays, and I'm blessing that I live in a modern era where I don't listen to podcasts, great sermons, listen to the scriptures in the car. So I spend a lot of time in the car listening to those sorts of things. I've got a couple of mates, and we've had a circle of accountability for decades. And if any of us steps outside that, woe behold us.
Great.
Should one of us choose to do something not honouring to our wives, in either input to our minds through things we might look at and see, through to inappropriate physical expressions with other people, those are just absolute no-go zones, and we hold ourselves to tight accountabilities on those sorts of issues. that accountability thing is really, really important because, whilst life oscillates, it prevents you from getting too far away from where you need to be.
Yeah.
There's got to be a level of trust and authenticity to make that work, but absolutely, I encourage everybody, find your circle of trust and become transparent in your relationship, and it will serve you in spades. You might think it difficult at the start and a challenge, but you find out that most of us are on the same journey and most of us have the same wrestles.
Yeah.
And so then finding that trusted circle where you can journey that together does not become a club where you can then rest in our failures, but becomes a really safe place in which we can keep those oscillations from where we want to be to a very minimal and sustainable level.
That's right.
And that is a fantastic place to be.
It's not a solo sport, is it?
It is not a solo.
We need people to be able to hold us accountable, as you say, and tell us to pull our head in from time to time, and a place where we could be genuinely authentic and we're told to confess our sins to each other.
Yes,
I think that's kind of gone out of popularity, but for me, I think the expression of that is just open, transparent, and authentic at that level of willing to be vulnerable with each other and hold each other accountable, support each other, encourage each other. Super important, and at the core of any community, I think is those people that in our lives that can do that.
And then in more recent times, and I've found this much more challenging to engage in, but also it's been extremely freeing, is having adult children and then them asking questions about things that they may perceive as being inconsistencies. And
So your children point out your inconsistencies as well?
and look, the first few, I still never find it comfortable and they're quite happy to engage in these discussions. And I guess that's the blessing of a generation beyond, their generation thinks differently about a lot of things. But that has also been very, very freeing as well. And there's an intimacy that comes with that with my adult boys particularly. And so whilst I found that at times an uncomfortable place to be in that, I'm your father, you're my son, why are you asking me these questions? But at the same time, it's been freeing, and the degree of intimacy that has built. And so, they're both now in their very early 30s, and it's becoming another circle of trust in the same way I've had with my couple of mates for decades. And that's taken my relationship with my sons into a different place, which now gives that relationship a foundation and a future that I would never have envisaged. But as kids grow up, that relationship needs to evolve and to change. And now that they're married and they're building their own lives, I talk to lots of people and their kids, cats in the cradle is their reality. And, we feel a little bit of that as well, but there's a reality too.
Yeah.
We raise them to be independent and to contribute to their own life and to, focus on their family first and foremost. So that's what we raise them to do. Don't be surprised they're doing it.
It's a whole new season, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a whole new, but at the same time, how does my relationship with my children, and if I'm blessed to be 90, and they're in their mid-60s, they're still my children. I'm still their dad. So how does that relationship evolve? So leaning into that space where they ask questions of their own faith, share their own journey, ask questions of me, which at an initial level might seem uncomfortable. Let me encourage you to lean into that space with your kids if that opportunity presents itself.
Absolutely.
Because it builds a new foundation with your kids that I'm pretty sure will serve you well.
Yeah, words of wisdom right there. One last thing. Most of the people that listen to this podcast, they're kind of wrestling with faith and work and how do I manage those things. We talked a bit about how to sort of witness and do those things with wisdom. Do you have any other advice for people who feel called to the marketplace, kind of wrestling with a professional career or starting a business or being a part of an early stage business where they're still trying to wrestle with all that? Any other words of wisdom for Christians in the marketplace?
Well, there's two elements to that. So one is the calling, and within my tradition, there was a great evangelist named John Chapman, passed away a few years ago, but just a brilliant communicator. And I remember going to youth convention up at Katoomba in my late teens, early 20s. And he told a story about when he graduated from school, and he's lived in a fairly humble house in inner city Sydney, and but a fairly smart guy. And so out of finishing what would have been the equivalent of year 11, so the end of high school back in the day, somehow he got application into both Sydney University and New South Wales University. But as a zealous young Christian man, he wanted to do the will of God. So he was praying that God would make it clear which university he was to go to. And John's understanding of how that would prevail was that he'd get one letter of acceptance and one letter of rejection. And so that would be God's clarity. Came home from wherever he was one day, and his parents are sitting at the round table, which is the dining room table in the old kitchen. And there's two letters on the table, one from New South Wales Uni, one from Sydney Uni. They'd arrived on the same day. So he picked them up and went off to his room and opened them without his parents present. Sat down by his bed, prayed over the two letters before he opened them, that God would in this moment make clear what he was to do. Opened up the first one, can't remember which one it was, acceptance to the university. Opened up the second one, acceptance to the university. In the immediate moment, God had failed him, not providing direction for his life. And for a moment there, he didn't know what to do. But over time, he come to understand it doesn't much matter what I am doing. It's who I am. And that is, I am God's person. I am fearfully, wonderfully made. I've been gifted to share those gifts with other people. And no matter where you find yourself in life or what you're doing, that truth doesn't change.
Yeah.
And so the first thing is, as with Chapo, as we all affectionately called him, just be God's person in the place that you find yourself, and take that as God's leading to where you are. And for some people, that becomes miraculous and quite overtly God's hand led you there.
Yeah.
For other people, life you just wake up each day, God, I'm your person, do with me as you will, and life unfolds and you find yourself on that journey. Either way, the miraculous or it's just how life is unfolding doesn't change the fact that you're God's person and that you are gifted, and the purpose of those gifts is to share that giftedness with other people where you find yourself. So just get on with that. At the same time, particularly during times of stress and difficulty, it's quite easy to lean into God in a more profound way during those times.
Only that.
It is the bringing all of my secular life to God and giving him thanks for the blessings that come, for the wonderful opportunities that it presents, for the experiences that I get to have because of the journey that I'm on, as well as the stressful times. And so I've had to learn how to get that balance better.
Yeah.
And I have got much better at that over the years as I've learned to deal with the stress more readily, has provided, I guess, the headspace to not forget to, I'm walking with God on the good days as well. I'm not just calling in on him in the times of difficulty.
I love that.
But he's with me all of those times. And so, be God's person wherever you are today. You're his ambassador. Pray that opportunity may come to present yourself as his ambassador, and then take the opportunities that as an ambassador he brings before you for what they are.
What a wonderful, wonderful piece of wisdom right there, Peter. So thank you for joining us today. Great pleasure. God bless you, my friend, your business and your life. It's great to be a part of your world. And thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thank you very much, Mark.
God bless you. Thanks. Bye. Thanks for listening and watching. I trust you enjoyed this latest podcast. Please like and subscribe. That really helps support the channel. And if you're interested in more information or you're on your Monday journey, you want to have Monday mastery, please check out our website at mondaymovement.com. All the links are below. Until next time, thanks for watching.